Mr. Duguid will speak today on disinformation, civil rights protests, and social justice. So please join me in welcoming him.
Well, I want to thank everyone
Louis,
for
the time is yours.
And Jeanette, thank you for the lovely introduction. It was more than I deserve. As I said earlier, I'm going to try to get through this fairly quickly, as Jeanette said, so that everyone here will have time for questions afterward. So I'm new to Zoom, and I'm going to work from a PowerPoint presentation. For those who don't know me, my email is at the bottom, and I'm happy to take questions later if you don't have a chance to get your question heard. So feel free to email me. As was mentioned earlier, this is the United Nations International Day of Peace, and it's been in place since 1981. But the popular press doesn't really accentuate this, doesn't really explain this to us, doesn't really tell us about this. And I read the newspaper and went through some of the websites today, and there was nothing about it in today's news. I want to also encourage people who are really proponents of peace to on December 31st at like 5 a.m., the Raimei Buddhist Center in Kansas City has a World Peace Meditation Day, and it's an opportunity to be with other people who really believe in this whole thing called peace. And then they also present a pretty significant award there that honors someone who's spent a lifetime of peace. From what Steve presented at the last session, it leaves open discussion that I think we need to touch on, and that's the dominance of the media in our lives. We spend more time, according to a Ball State University study, with the media than we do at work, than we do if we're students, both in class and studying. We spend more time with the media than we do sleeping, and we don't really focus on any one media. It's several media often at the same time, so that they are the ones that are providing us with information about everything in life. And if you look at this USA Today 2018 piece, it talks about how millennials, 74% of millennials get their news and information from social media. And then what's really striking is children also are incredibly dependent on the media. And what's fascinating to me is that children of color consume more hours of media than anyone else, even though the media doesn't really address and speak to them specifically. Now, it's often important to understand what news is, and this will become more relevant as we go through the slides. Adventure and conflict, changing times, odd and unusual, its seasonality or timeliness. It involves money, it involves religion, weather, changing climates, elections, ethics, morality, criminal behavior, and then, of course, the fall from grace, someone who had it all and loses it. The Falwell family right now comes to mind. And then, of course, everything involving race, diversity, and civil rights. When you combine any one of these, or several of them, then it causes the value of those stories to escalate, so that instead of being downstream in appearance in newspapers, magazines, it runs up toward the front page and also toward the top of the news stories on TV, radio. This is, I think, really important because it talks about how the media really, as entities, take over when it comes to what we normally get from other individuals. And they become humanized. They are reliable because they appear regularly. They educate, they socialize us. They reinforce what we know. They are humorous, they unify and divide. They teach us how to dress, what to eat, where to eat, and when, how to spend money, how to interact with others. And then they also provide us with that happiness. And they become conversation starters that we have with other people. They provide us with trust and credibility. And then there's this whole thing of the constant unfounded news charges, the disinformation, the misinformation, the malinformation that emanates from the White House and other places that help us to not only disregard the traditional news media, but also to question what we think we know about the things that we get from the media in general and how that affects our sense of self and our sense of well-being. Again, it continues to divide. Now, I like to go back to my days in college, taking a philosophy class and understanding how we can interpret not only the media, but reality, and whether we can know anything that we see, hear, taste, touch, or perceive. Plato's example of reality is that we as human beings, not being deities, can only see the shadows of real reality on the wall. Because we're not God, we cannot see the actual things themselves, and therefore we are subject to only receiving a piece of that reality. The media pulls it back even further, describing the shadows to us. And so you have to take that in mind when you consider what the media are presenting to us on a daily basis. I also want to, and we touched on this at the last session that Steve led, and that's the numbers. You have to understand that all of this goes back to the Kerner Commission, a report of 1968, looking at the cause of the 1967 riots in the United States. And the Kerner Commission set out that part of the cause for the riots had to rest on the shoulders of the media because the media failed miserably to explain what was taking place in the communities of color where unemployment was astronomically high, living conditions were astronomically poor, and people were suffering, and it was a powder keg just ready to blow. AS&E, the American Society of News Editors, decided in 1978, 10 years after the Kerner Commission report, to try to right conditions. And so in 1978, 4% of all newsroom jobs by journalists were held by journalists of color. And to put a finer point on that, I used to joke with people, because I started my career at the Star in 1977, that there were so few African-American journalists at then the Star and the Times, both owned by the same company, that you could count us on two hands and still have enough fingers to smoke a cigarette and drink a beer. We're not much better now. In 1980, 21.93% of the population in the U.S. were people of color. And then the population was 226,000. The population has grown to 226 million. The population has grown to 331 million. But the percentage of people of color has also grown to more than 33%, and it will exceed 50% by the year 2042. So we're chasing a moving deadline, and AS&E, instead of sticking with the 2000 deadline to be at parity with the population, pushed the deadline back to 2025. That's only 5 years off, and it looks absolutely unachievable. I went into a little bit of the Kerner Commission report's findings, but it essentially said that news media throughout the country were not covering conditions in the ghettos in the United States. And all of this looks as if it's repeating itself because the news media are continuing to do a poor job, and we're seeing unrest now in many cities. Existentialism, again, a topic from when I was in philosophy class in college, but it also applies to the media. The media are supposed to explain things to people so that they have an understanding of what's taking place, and with information they can make better choices. And those better choices allow them to handle their lives, use their resources better. But if they are purposely, if the information is purposely truncated by racism, sexism, homophobia, elitism, and all of the others, then people don't have a chance to get accurate information, and so they are led into existential victimhood because they are purposely being prevented from seeing the truth. And it leads to stereotypes, it leads to discrimination, it leads to prejudices and the divisions that we see now. And of course, our president continuing to fuel those divides. It causes conservatives to look as if they are pro-American, liberal, progressive, and protesters as being un-American. And I want to encourage you, if you have a chance, to see the documentary Out Fox, because I think it explains why Fox News has become the #1 news, cable news network in the country. And then the isms also continue our explicit and implicit biases. The things that we don't see are also quite striking. I was doing research for a book on trips that the National Association for Multicultural Education has taken over the last 6 years to Cuba. And I happened across, from reading the Havana Times, this whole thing called the International Decade of People of African Descent. And it runs from 2015 to 2024, or 24. And I think that what we've missed in this country is an understanding that this is important, that this is a big deal, that this is something that if we had known about it, would help to cause people to be less concerned, less outraged in the protests that have taken place. Keep in mind that the media are going through their own financial difficulties. The Great Recession was a gut punch, and that the media are retrenching, pulling back from local coverage, covering cops, courts, politics, because they're easy. And so the more difficult things become more costly. And then there are the issues of unrest. And the media tend to focus, going back to what is news, on what is conflict and controversy and the unusual. And so the things that really stand out are the ones that become violent. They've classified these as riots, but having been to Ferguson during the unrest after Michael Brown's death in 2014, this was no riot. I was, as a kid, on a family vacation in Detroit after the '67 riots. That was a riot. This is nothing compared to that. And then, of course, the unrest, the anger, that becomes something that boils out in the photographs, in the coverage of the media. And then, of course, there was the Charlottesville, Virginia incident, and how that was depicted in the media. And we have the George Floyd incident, with Floyd being on the ground, held down for 8 minutes, 46 seconds, and the cops doing nothing. Thank goodness that charges have been filed. But keep in mind that there is an extra protective layer around the cops that prevents them from actually being charged, well, not being charged, but convicted of the crimes that occur in the deaths of unarmed African Americans. And of course, the unrest that blew up after George Floyd's death. And then there's the ongoing deaths of other African Americans.
Okay.
That continue in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and then the inequality that's occurred because of Jacob Blake's carrying a gun and shooting 3 protesters, killing 2, pulls that out as well. And of course, there's the ongoing protest in Portland, Oregon, which Trump is capitalizing on, calling himself the law and order president. So these are political issues that are boiling into the voting booth. I added this quote from King because I thought it was important that it's when people are unheard, when the media have done a poor job of explaining things, that things blow up. The press are in place and the media are in place to try to explain to people where the needs are, and so that the needs can be addressed by the larger society, and they are not. And then, of course, this quote that I think applies to everyone, that we cannot be silent about things that matter. For individuals who are on the discussion, I think that this one matters, and this is a variation of what I tell journalists: you're only as good as a peace-building, anti-racist citizen as the depth and breadth of your knowledge and experiences as a human being. And that means we have to have more experiences as a human being with one another in order to get to a point where we can be able to have conversations that are peaceful and meaningful. I put together this 5 media functions because it's when we fracture the population into demographic components that we can see the effects of the media on individuals. There are 5 components to the media surveillance. We go into places and check out what's going on and then report back, places where people normally don't have a chance to go. The media also correlate things so that if there's a problem in Lawrence, a problem in Liberty, and a problem in Peculiar, Missouri, but they're the same problem, and Lawrence has all of these wonderful problem solvers, and they're able to solve the problem, then the problem can be solved in all of those other places too. Transmission is the socialization function of the media. It's one in which we hold individuals up for praise and noteworthiness. They've won awards, they've done incredible things, and we want our children and more citizens in our community to be like those individuals. Entertainment is the function of the media that is for diversion, to make you laugh, to cry, to forget about your own troubles. It's music, it's sports, it's television, it's theater, it's movies. It's the things that, again, are just to make you forget your own problems. The economic function of the media is mostly advertising, and it's split into 2 different components. One is the advertising tells you who in your community is the purchaser of products and services, and then it also tells you who makes those products and services. Again, it's when you fracture the population into component parts that you come to an understanding of how the media affect individuals in particular groups. For this exercise, I've fractured the demographics of the United States into people of color and people who are normally disregarded or left out, and then those who aren't, so that you can see the effect of the media. To make this quick, I've already done the work. When you look at African Americans representing 13.36% of the US population to grow to 13.1 by 2045, African Americans show up in only 2 of the 5 media functions in representative numbers, and that means at least 13.36%. And so we are surveilling African Americans. We are trying to find out what are they doing to our way of life, what's wrong with these people, why are they underperformers, why are they ne'er-do-wells. But then we also see African Americans show up in entertainment as individuals who are sports aficionados, individuals who can catch a ball, throw a ball, bounce a ball, and fall on a ball better than anyone. And yes, these are individuals who are funny too. When we ask ourselves about Latinos, they are 19% of the US population, and this is a number that's going to grow by 2045 to 24.6%. Yet they only show up in one area of media functions, and that's surveillance. And Trump has underscored that with everything that he said about people who are undocumented in this country. When we look at Asian Americans, they're 5% of the US population. It's to grow to 7.8% by 2045. Yet we don't see them in the media in representative numbers, and they don't see themselves. And so this is an invisible part of our population, and that's not good. Native Americans fall into a similar boat. They're only 1.5% of the US population, but most of us don't know that there are more than 500 sovereign nations of Native Americans in the United States, and that these are individuals yet who are invisible. When we look at the LGBTQIA community, it's 10% of the US population, yet this is a group that shows up and sees itself only in this area of surveillance. And that's something that's become more prominent since Trump has become president. And then with people with disabilities, 17% of the US population, according to Diversity Inc., has disabilities, yet when you consider people who are older, people who acquire disabilities as they age, it's actually greater than 50%, those disabilities that you cannot see. And Muslims, this is a large group of people in the US. Before September 11, 2001, this group was like Native Americans, Asian Americans, and people with disabilities. They were invisible. After September 11, 2001, they became prominent. The same as there is racial profiling with African Americans and driving while Black or brown. There is racial profiling with people who are Muslim, so that it's flying while Muslim. And then to jump to another group, 52% of the population consists of women, but women only show up in 3 of the 5 media functions. They are in the economic function because according to the census, women control the purse strings in 80% of all US households. And advertisers know this. They know that women have to they have to direct their products and services to women because they buy things for dumb guys like me who don't shop. Women also show up in entertainment, but when you look through the stream of stories and selections on the women's channels, Lifetime, We, Oxygen, they might as well be called the victims channels because we don't get an accurate picture of women. They always need strong guys to come to their rescue, or they're being chased or mugged, or something dramatic is going on. And women show up in surveillance because they're either so meek and they need help by strong guys to come to their rescue, or they're like Hillary Clinton and they have to be watched because you don't know what they might do to you. And then there are white males, 32% of the population, yet white males show up in all 5 of the media functions. They are producers of products and services in economics, and they are pictured in the ads. They entertain us in sports, movies, music, theater. They are individuals who are held up for noteworthiness in the transmission function. Then they connect the dots for us. They are problem solvers. And yes, they do cause some problems too. But on balance, we see that white males are individuals who are incredible citizens. And That's good. I like it like that. But that should be the case with all of the other categories of people and the demographics of the US. And the media have fallen down miserably when it comes to covering the stories of people of color and women. And the reason that they do that is they aim at a target audience, and they always have. The target has been like a bullseye, and it consists of individuals who are seated and positioned neatly within that bullseye. And that bullseye is the community overall or society overall. And it aims at a white, middle class, and now suburban audience. People who don't fall within the target are in the satellite entities outside of the target, and they are described in what's called a shorthand of stereotypes. This comes from Felix Gutierrez and Clint Wilson's book, Minorities in Media. And it's very clear when you analyze the media, and we did when I was doing diversity work at the STAR, that this is a problem. This has to be dismantled. I also think it's important to understand what stereotypes are. Walter Lippmann, who coined the phrase, explains that it's the subtlest, most pervasive influences that exist and maintain stereotypes. We're told about things before we see them. We imagine most things before we experience them. These preconceptions, unless education has made us acutely aware, govern deeply the whole process of perception. And unfortunately, our schools feed the perceptions of stereotypes. Jane Elliott, who did the Class Divided documentary, if you get a chance to see it or haven't seen it, please do, it's worth it, said in an interview that I did with her for the STAR in the 1990s that if you want to raise a racist, sexist, homophobic, elitist, classist, and violent kid, put that kid in front of a TV set, turn it on, and walk away. It's guaranteed. The same is true now with computers, smartphones, tablets, and everything. It's a problem, and it's even worse with kids of color. I think it's important to also understand why the media have really thrown all this stuff at us, giving us good information on white males, but such deficient information on others. When you look at 10 richest Americans, 100% are white. Top military advisors, 100% are white. Those who decide what goes on TV, 93% are white. Those who decide what goes in books, 90% are white. Those who decide what's covered in the news, 85% are white. The music that's produced, 95% are white. 100% of the all-time top films, 95% are white. Teachers, 82% are white. College professors, 84% are white. There's nothing wrong with being white, but I think we have to really think about how can we diversify this country if we want everybody to reach his or her potential and to end the violence. This is a quote that I pulled from Mary Frances Berry's book, The Pig Farmer's Daughter. It goes into how there is this perpetuation of power and how African Americans are excluded from systems of power, the same as Latinos, the same as women, the same as people in the LGBTQIA, the same as Native Americans, the same as Asian Americans are. And it's a very powerful quote, and this is about the legal system, but it really is about all of the institutions in this country. This is from Dr. Joy DeGruy's book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, and she points out that policing is a problem, and it's why African Americans have issues with the cops and always have, because they began as slave patrols, and those patrols have continued with the roots being keeping Black people in line and in their place, continued with that same kind of violence on Black and brown people to this day. I love this cartoon. And it talks about how Goldilocks is seen as the victim, whereas you have to understand how racism works to understand how the three bears are actually being put to the wall. John McKinsey established this organization called the Recovering Racist Network, and it essentially says that because we live in this country and this country is racist through and through, that all of us are racist, and we have to work constantly to overcome that racism, so that we need a multi-step program to get to that point, to really become advocates for equality and social justice. This is my version of what the news media or journalism should be. We should get people to read, we should get people to remember, we should get people to react, and then to repeat. But we don't do that. We bore the crap out of people with giving them the same old stuff. This is what equality looks like. This is what equity looks like. Very important. Same number of boxes, but everyone gets a chance to watch the game. These are some formulas that I put together that really go into why I think diversity and inclusion matter. Everyone is talented. Diversity and inclusion are the multipliers, and the talent goes through the multipliers in order to achieve a high productivity. We all have to serve as diversity inclusion multipliers for others to reach a productivity, or to get others to reach a productivity level, and we have to seek diversity and inclusion multipliers for ourselves as well. This is another formula: talk times diversity inclusion equals social capital. Social capital is what grows when people get together to discuss things. And again, that's apart from the media. This is just individuals talking. Folks who are similar talking creates social bonding. Social bridging is what occurs when people who are different get together to talk. And that's so very important. And new ideas come from that. Problem identifying, problem solving abilities grow. Intellectual capital grows, intellectual property grows, and then the sense of community grows, so that you don't have people orbiting outside of that target, and you get growth in it altogether. And it really speaks to what's in it for me, and that's getting other people to be as creative as they can be. Then another formula is hope or prayer times work, plus work times diversity inclusion equals change. We have to have hope, we have to pray for that, but we have to work with that in order to achieve what we need, and that's change. But then when we recruit other people as diversity inclusion multipliers, change is possible. And then for those who are familiar with these formulas out of my second book, Discovering the Real America, I've added a third, and that is individuals times diversity and inclusion equals belonging. And we have to get to a point where people feel that they belong, and we're not there by a long shot. I want to close with this last slide, which is from the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, from Doris Herrera. She says, and she was a person who was with Cesar Chavez during the farm workers' work, and that's for us to walk the street with us into history, get off the sidewalk. So very important. And last but not least, an action plan. It's important for individuals to become more active and engaged, write letters to the editor, write TV and radio stations, to watch the traditional media, TV, radio, mainstream press, the minority press, and start your own website if you think that there's something that isn't being said, so that you get at the information that needs to come out more than what you find the press are doing. But make sure you have something worthwhile to say. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, that is it. So, questions?
Thank you so much, Mr. Duguid. And so far we have one question.
which is just commenting on the representation of minorities in journalism. And you've mentioned that there is a program in effect which hasn't been completely effective. Is the trend in the right direction, or how do you see the trends in terms of anchors and reporters within journalism?
Well, that's a good question. The American Society of Newspaper Editors, as it was originally called, now news editors because of the organization's expansion into other media, wanted sincerely to encourage the media to do more to actually meet the Kerner Commission's edict that the press really cover all communities and communities of color in particular. But the media are as steeped in the white tradition, you can even say white supremacy, as much as any other institution in this country. And so they don't see the value of having people of color in positions. In the time that I worked for the newspaper, and that's 4 decades, it was always a fight to get the newspaper to hire and even promote people of color. A fight because there was always something wrong with the individuals, whereas that wasn't the case with people who are white and male seeking similar positions. So the press are as recalcitrant as any institution in America, and probably even more so because the press see themselves as entities that are constantly pushing the values and mores and the folkways of this country. And so if that includes racism, and sexism, and homophobia, then that's what you see. And often what you don't see really speaks volumes to what the media are saying in addition. Other questions?
I was wondering if you would comment on the coverage, just a little bit on the coverage of Black men in the news media. For example, there was, very sadly, an Overland Park police officer killed several months ago, and I hadn't read a lot about it, but I commented to my African-American nephew. I said to him, I think it was the white man that killed the police officer. And he said, why? And I said, because every news coverage that I've covered just calls him a man. And my nephew thought about it, and he said, you're right, because if it was a black man, they would call him a black man. But when it's a white man, he's just a man. And there's been a lot of comment in various locations about the phrase unarmed black man, as though that's only kind of an aberration or a subset of the larger whole, even though I have many white relatives and friends who are always armed and have concealed carry. So would you comment on that? And especially you wrote a book subtitled Making Black Men. How does that representation, since they absorb so much media, how does that impact them?
Sure. Let me back up to the 1800s after slavery. There was really, in some cases, laws and in some cases unwritten laws that prevented African Americans from owning guns, and that was when the country was mostly agrarian, based on an agrarian economy, and people used guns for hunting. But that was in place because the most fearful thing to people during slavery and then post-slavery were African American men with weapons that were lethal. And so it was pointed out to me by the National Rifle Association, if you can believe it or not, that the liberalization of laws on gun ownership were directly beneficial to African Americans. Yet during the 1960s, during the Black Power movement, the most dreadful and fearful thing that occurred were Black Panthers armed with weapons. And that's why the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover went out after them with a vengeance. And still, it is a problem that African Americans are feared and loathed, African American men in particular, because of this dangerous element, this criminal element, which is accentuated and enlarged by the media. And though people in general, because of our largely segregated society, have no direct contact with African Americans in general, they fear Black men just across the board because of what they've been taught by the media to fear. And so this is a pervasive problem that is only accentuated by the media. And you're right, news stories generally just say man when it comes to white men. But they often now run mugshots, though the Kansas City Star is backing away from that because they see how that affects the population. They run mugshots when the perpetrators or those who are accused are African American men, because that creates this ongoing fear. Now, the problem is that if the news media in general were to project an accurate picture of African Americans overall as being good citizens, raising their children, living their lives, working their jobs, individuals who are contributing to the community overall, then there wouldn't be this problem of the same as there isn't a problem with white males being outed for these crimes. Today on NPR, I was listening to the segment on Robert Courtney. It was a horrible situation in the early 2000s. This was a pharmacist who diluted the chemotherapy drugs of people so that he can make a killing, well, excuse me, wrong words, so that he can make a lot of money being a pharmacist. And yet people died as a result of it, more than 40. And yet we don't fear all white men, particularly white men who are pharmacists. The mass shooters in this country, those who've killed many people, they're white men. Yet we don't fear all white men because of that. And that's because the image that we have of them overall is good, but the image of African American men is anything but good. Other questions?
Stephen Youngblood has the question, how is white privilege reflected in news coverage? Well,
white privilege really is involved in all coverage of all media and all programming and in everything, because people who are white are seen as normal. They are individuals who are the standard. They are individuals who are human. They are individuals who we all must aspire to be like. And the media focus on that because it is just a natural human tendency of individuals who populate the press to also go after stories that are like or about people like them. And so it is just a self-fulfilling prophecy that this white privilege really explains why the stories that we see in the press are mostly about people who are white. Largely, yes, our community is mostly white, but when you consider that in Kansas City alone, 30% of the population of Kansas City proper is African American. 17% of the population of Kansas City proper is Latino. But we don't see anywhere near enough stories following the full spectrum of what journalism and the media are supposed to be about these individuals, whether it's on television, radio, newspapers, magazines, etc. It's just not there. We catch it when we view the Black press, the Call or the Globe, or the Latino press, Dos Mundos, or the Hispanic news. But otherwise, we don't see it. And for people who are Asian American, they just don't exist. People who are Native Americans, they don't exist. Ages ago, when I was a columnist with the newspaper, I wrote about the horror that the Kansas City Chiefs perpetuate with the headdress and the chop, and how terrible this is to Native Americans. And I heard from a few Native Americans who live in this area, and they were like, "Thank you for taking the time to write about these issues that are of concern to us." But everyone else came after me like I had decided to urinate on a statue that everyone loved. So it's when you do these things in the media, you pay the price.
Someone has the question, Jamie has the question, that perhaps the issues in the news media are not really lack of diversity, but the pull of sensationalism. How do you respond to that argument?
Sensationalism is a problem, but diversity is the bigger issue. Keep in mind that when you have more people from different walks of life, different perspectives, adding to what is considered news, where things are played, whether it's at the top or at the bottom, then it becomes a way of restructuring what would otherwise be a run to publish or a run to get something on the air that seems titillating and exciting on face value. But if you don't have people who are within the organization saying, "Excuse me, but that's particularly racist," or "That's particularly homophobic," or it just promotes gender bias, then you don't have that pause. And we need that pause within the media to add the different voices, because when we have this rush, you again have to go back to the slide that I showed you of what the media are doing in our lives, what voice they create and how they socialize us. When you have the media that are pushing these buttons that say this is good, this is bad, and television does that more than anything, social media as well, then you don't have that pause to say, well, maybe it's not. Maybe we need another voice. Maybe we need some other comments in there to sort of slow this process down. Or maybe we're rushing into something that really is wrong.
Thanks. And then there's a final question, which is, first of all, I love your whole comment about a pause. But having people in the organization who can feel and see and understand how a different population feels because they belong to that population, that's a pause. But do you have any thoughts on, let's see, what form of media is making the most progress with regard to correcting previous biases?
I want to encourage people to go to a website that is KCABJ. It is for the Kansas City Association of Black Journalists, kcabj.org. In there, you'll find the KCABJ blog, and it's just a highlighted area. Click on that, and I do the newsletter for the organization. And it talks about in the newsletter how Gannett has made a promise with its more than 100 media outlets throughout the country, and of course USA Today, that it will have by the year 2025 achieved parity with the population as AS&E set out, so that the percentage of journalists of color and women working for Gannett will equal the percentage of people of color and women in the population. And again, that creates an opportunity for more voices to really affect the tenor and the tone and the quality of what goes into news. During the time that I was with the Kansas City Star, I took a commitment, just because of how I was raised, that if I needed to strap myself to the train track to prevent the freight train from plowing through and putting bad information in front of people in the Kansas City area, I was going to do it. And they saw that I was nuts, and so they gave me some leeway. And I said, well, maybe we need to listen to this guy. And you cannot be afraid. You cannot be afraid to be that voice as a person writing a letter, as a person making that phone call, as a person sending an email. You have to take action. And you have to understand that your voice matters. It's not something that is irrelevant or inconsequential. The same as your vote is not irrelevant or inconsequential. It matters. As a friend of mine who worked on 4 continents in the press told me ages ago, the news media are like seat cushions. They bear the impression of the ass that last sat on them. And so you have to be that ass. You have to be that person who sits on the press that says, what you did here was wrong, and here's the way to correct that. I still am involved with the people at the Star, though I left that newspaper in October of 2016, because I think that we all have a role to play as citizens, because we want the best for this community.
Thank you so much, Mr. Duguid.
Well, thank you, Jeanette Jasperson, and everyone who connected. I hope this has been worth your while, and I appreciate the opportunity.